They called it a place of learning, where silence carried heavier than prayer and the walls listened more than the teachers. For 20 years, young men and women entered Millrow Seminary, never to leave again. Not a scream was heard. Not a witness came forward. Only the cold wind off the moors carried their absence. But what happens when someone refuses to let the silence win? What happens when love drives you into the very heart of darkness itself? The carriage wheels carved deep ruts into the muddy path, each turn bringing Clara Henley closer to the place that had swallowed her brother whole. Millrow Seminary rose from the moors like a wound that refused to heal, its Gothic spires piercing the grey October sky with an almost violent determination. The driver, a weathered man whose hands trembled against the reins, had grown quieter with each mile they'd travelled from the village. "You sure about this, miss?" He'd asked 3 times already. Now, as the seminary's iron gates came into view, he asked no more questions. Some answers, Clara realized, were too dangerous to hear. The building itself seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Built in 1823 on the bones of a much older abbey, Millrow Seminary had been designed to reform wayward souls through strict theological study. But as Clara stepped from the carriage, her traveling case heavy in her gloved hands, she felt something else entirely watching from those countless dark windows. The stones themselves seemed to whisper of secrets buried deep, of prayers that had gone unanswered for far too long. Her brother Thomas had walked through these same gates 18 months ago. His letters home had been cheerful at first, filled with descriptions of morning prayers and evening studies, of newfound purpose and spiritual awakening. Then, gradually, the letters had grown shorter, more distant. The last one she'd received contained only 7 words: "The silence here teaches more than words ever could." After that, nothing. The headmaster who greeted her at the entrance was a tall, angular man whose age seemed to shift in the candlelight. Sometimes he appeared middle-aged, with graying temples and laugh lines around his eyes. But when he turned his head a certain way, when the shadows fell just so across his face, Clara could swear he looked ancient beyond measure. "Miss Henley," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, "we've been expecting you." Those words sent ice through her veins. She had written only a week ago, requesting admission under the pretense of seeking theological education for women. How could they have been expecting her? The interior of the seminary was a maze of narrow corridors and high-ceilinged chambers, each one filled with that same oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of her own footsteps. Students moved through the halls like ghosts, their eyes downcast, their lips pressed tight as if speaking might invite punishment. When Clara tried to catch the eye of a young man about Thomas's age, he quickly looked away, but not before she saw something there that made her heart race with fear. Terror, pure, unadulterated terror. Her dormitory room was sparse but clean, containing little more than a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a wash basin that reflected her face in fractured pieces. As she unpacked her few belongings, Clara noticed scratch marks on the inside of the door frame. Someone had been keeping count of something, days perhaps, or nights. The evening meal was taken in complete silence, as dictated by seminary rules. 60 students sat at long wooden tables, their spoons clicking against ceramic bowls in a rhythm that sounded almost ritualistic. Clara found herself seated next to a pale, thin young man who introduced himself in a whisper as Elias Worthington. "How long have you been here?" she asked quietly, careful to keep her voice below the notice of the stern-faced monitors who paced between the tables. Elias's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Time moves differently here," he said, and something in his tone made Clara's skin crawl. "Some say it stops altogether." That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind howl across the moors, she heard it for the first time, the deep, resonant toll of a bell, ringing 12 times in the darkness. She rose and went to her window, pressing her face against the cold glass, but she could see no bell tower. The seminary's lone spire stood dark and empty against the starless sky. The tolling stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Clara waited, holding her breath, but the only sound was her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. When she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of Thomas calling her name from somewhere deep beneath the ground, his voice growing fainter with each repetition until it disappeared entirely into the earth. But here's what haunts me most about that first night, and what should terrify you too. Clara never asked herself why she could hear that bell so clearly when no one else seemed to notice it at all. Have you ever wondered what it means when the darkness calls to you personally, when it knows your name before you've even spoken it aloud? The seminary's routines were carved from stone and enforced with religious fervor. Dawn prayers at 5, breakfast in silence, morning studies until noon, afternoon prayers, evening studies, dinner in continued silence, and final prayers before sleep. Between each scheduled moment stretched vast expanses of quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. Clara learned quickly that questions were discouraged, curiosity was dangerous, and conversations were monitored by students who had learned that survival sometimes meant betraying others. But Elias Worthington, she discovered, had managed to retain some spark of humanity in this place that seemed designed to extinguish it. "They disappear in 2s and 3s, he told her one afternoon, as they shelved books in the seminary's vast library. His voice was barely a whisper, and his eyes darted constantly to the shadows between the towering shelves. Every few years, like clockwork, but the records always show they transferred to other institutions or returned home for family emergencies." Clara's fingers tightened on the leather-bound volume she was holding. "How many?" "In the 20 years since I've been tracking." Elias paused, and Clara realized with horror that he couldn't possibly have been here for 20 years. He looked no older than 25. Over 50 names have vanished from the seminary's books. 50 young people who walked through those gates and simply ceased to exist. The afternoon light filtering through the library's stained glass windows seemed to dim as he spoke, casting their faces in shades of deep red and purple that made them look like figures in a medieval manuscript about damnation. "But surely someone will investigate," Clara said. "Families must ask questions. The authorities, the seminary's benefactors," Elias interrupted, "own half the mines in Yorkshire and have funded 3 bishops' dioceses. Their wealth is older than the crown itself, and their influence reaches into places most people can't even imagine. When Millrow Seminary says a student has transferred, no one questions it, no one dares." That evening, while searching for Thomas's belongings in the storage rooms beneath the dormitories, Clara found something that made her blood freeze. Carved into the wooden surface of an abandoned desk, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were the initials T. Thomas Henley. Her brother had been here, had sat at this very desk, had carved his name into the wood, perhaps in the hope that someone would find it someday. Below his initials, scratched in what looked like fingernails rather than a knife, were tally marks, 17 of them. Clara ran her fingers over the marks, trying to understand what they meant. Days until something happened. People who had disappeared, or something far worse she couldn't yet comprehend. That night, unable to sleep, she decided to explore the corridors that had been declared off-limits to students. The seminary felt different in darkness, as if the very walls shed their daytime pretense of holy purpose and revealed something far more ancient underneath. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, despite her attempts at silence, and more than once she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. She was making her way down a particularly narrow hallway when she heard them footsteps behind her, matching her pace exactly. When she stopped, they stopped. When she quickened her stride, they quickened too. But when she finally gathered the courage to turn around, the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued anyway, following her all the way back to her dormitory room. They stopped only when she reached her door, and in the sudden silence that followed, Clara could swear she heard something that sounded like breathing just inches from her face. She threw herself into her room and locked the door, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Only then did she notice the envelope that had been slipped under her door while she was gone. Inside was a single piece of paper with 7 words written in Thomas's handwriting: "Stop looking, or join us in silence." The ink was still wet. Clara stared at the note until her eyes burned, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Thomas's handwriting, yes, but how could that be possible? If he had left the seminary months ago, as the records claimed, how could he have written this note tonight? And if he was still here, somewhere in this maze of stone and shadow, why was he warning her away instead of calling out for help? She folded the note carefully and placed it in her trunk, but sleep eluded her entirely. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face as she remembered it from childhood, laughing, alive, full of dreams about making the world a better place. The brother who had taught her to read, who had defended her against schoolyard bullies, who had promised to write to her every week from the seminary. But now, if that note was truly from him, what had this place turned him into? What had it done to him that made him want to protect the very institution that had stolen his life? And here's the question that should keep you awake tonight, just as it kept Clara staring at the ceiling until dawn. If someone you loved with all your heart begged you to stop searching for them, would you listen? Or would you realize that the very fact they were begging meant they needed you more than ever before? The seminary's chapel had been built to inspire awe, but what Clara felt when she first stepped inside was something far darker than reverence. The vaulted ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of biblical judgment, but the faces of the saints and sinners alike wore expressions of such anguish that Clara had to look away. Students filed in for morning prayers with their eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking directly at the altar might invite divine punishment. Clara noticed that none of them sat in the first 3 rows, leaving those pews empty despite the crowded conditions elsewhere. When she asked a fellow student why, the girl, Margaret Ashworth, a timid thing with red hair and nervous hands, simply shook her head. "Those seats are reserved," she whispered, but wouldn't say for whom. The headmaster's sermons were masterpieces of theological terror, each one a carefully crafted reminder of human frailty and divine wrath. He spoke of sin as if it were a living thing that crept through the seminary's halls, searching for weak souls to devour. He described hell in such vivid detail that several students fainted during services, yet his voice never rose above a conversational tone. That quiet delivery somehow made his words infinitely more terrifying. But it was what Clara saw beneath the altar that truly chilled her blood. She had stayed after evening prayers, using the excuse of private devotion to examine the chapel more closely. The other students filed out quickly, as they always did, leaving her alone in the vast space with only the flickering candles for company. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her eardrums like deep water, but she forced herself to approach the altar step by step. The marble was old, older than the seminary itself, and carved with symbols that had nothing to do with Christian worship. Spirals within spirals, twisted knots that seemed to writhe when viewed from the corner of her eye, and strange characters that might have been letters in some forgotten language. These markings were subtle, worked into the decorative elements with such skill that they would be invisible to anyone not looking for them specifically. But Clara was looking, and what she found made her understand why the front pews remained empty. The symbols weren't decorative at all, they were instructions. "You shouldn't be here after dark." Clara spun around to find Margaret standing in the chapel doorway, her pale face ghostly in the candlelight. The girl looked terrified, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. "I was just praying," Clara said, which was true enough. "Not here," Margaret insisted, hurrying forward to grab Clara's arm. "Never here, not after sunset. The chapel, it changes when darkness falls. It remembers what it used to be before the seminary claimed it." "What do you mean?" Margaret glanced around nervously. as if the walls themselves might be listening. The stones weren't quarried for this place. They were salvaged from somewhere else, somewhere that was destroyed for good reason. The church that stood here before, the one this seminary was built on top of, it was condemned for heresy, burned to the ground with its priests still inside. Clara felt the temperature in the chapel drop several degrees. What kind of heresy? The kind that opens doors better left closed, Margaret whispered. The kind that calls to things in the dark and expects them to answer. And sometimes, Miss Henley, they do answer. That night, Clara returned to her room to find an old hymn book on her pillow, its leather binding cracked with age. When she opened it, she discovered that someone had sewn several pages together with black thread, creating a hidden pocket. Inside was a collection of papers covered in desperate handwriting, names, dates, and fragmentary accounts that painted a picture of systematic terror. September 3rd. William Hartwell vanished from his bed. His sheets were damp, as if he had been carried away while still sleeping. October 12th. The Brennan twins disappeared during evening prayers. No one saw them leave the chapel, but they were gone when the service ended. November 21st. I found Thomas Henley's room empty this morning. The window was open, but we're on the 3rd floor. There were no footprints in the mud below. Clara's hands shook as she read Thomas's name. Someone had been documenting the disappearances, maintaining a record that the seminary's official books would never show. But who, and why had they chosen to share this information with her? The final entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. They know I've been watching. Tonight I hear them calling my name from beneath the chapel floor. If anyone finds this record, remember that we did not go willingly into that silence. We were taken. The handwriting was Margaret's. Clara looked up from the papers to find her room suddenly, inexplicably cold. Her breath misted in the air, and frost was forming on the inside of her window, despite the mild October weather. From somewhere deep in the seminary's foundations, she could hear a sound that made her soul recoil, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language that predated human speech. She grabbed her shawl and ran to Margaret's room, but when she knocked on the door, there was no answer. When she tried the handle, the door swung open to reveal a space that looked as if it had been empty for years. No clothes in the wardrobe, no books on the desk, no sign that anyone had ever lived there at all. But Clara remembered Margaret. She remembered their conversation in the chapel, the terror in the girl's voice, the way her hands had trembled as she spoke of doors better left closed. So why did everyone else act as if Margaret Ashworth had never existed? And why, when Clara asked about her the next morning, did even the headmaster look genuinely puzzled by the name? The question that should haunt you, dear listener, is this. If someone can be erased so completely that even their closest friends forget they ever existed, what hope do any of us have of leaving a mark on this world? What happens when the darkness decides you were never here at all? The headmaster's study occupied the highest room in the seminary's main tower, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to ascend far higher than the building's exterior would suggest. Clara had been planning her infiltration for 3 days, studying the routines of the monitors and staff, learning when the study would be empty and unguarded. She chose a night when storms lashed the moors with particular fury, when thunder would mask any sounds she might make, and lightning would provide brief moments of illumination in the darkened corridors. The seminary felt different during storms, as if the violence of the weather outside awakened something equally violent within its walls. The lock on the study door was old but well-maintained, and Clara's childhood lessons from her father, a man who believed his daughter should know how to be useful in any situation, served her well. The tumblers fell into place with satisfying clicks, and she slipped inside just as another bolt of lightning turned the world white. The study was a reflection of its occupant, severe, organized, and somehow timeless. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings unmarked by age despite their obvious antiquity. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface bare except for an inkwell, a quill pen, and a single leather-bound ledger. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the ledger, expecting to find routine records of enrollment and graduation. Instead, she discovered a catalogue of horror that made her stomach turn. Page after page of names, each one meticulously recorded in the same precise handwriting. But these weren't simple student records. Next to each name was a date, and next to each date was a single word written in red ink. Offered. William Hartwell, October 15th, 1847. Offered. The Brennan twins, November 3rd, 1847. Offered. Thomas Henley, March 21st, 1848. Offered. Clara's vision blurred as she stared at her brother's name. The date was wrong. According to the seminary's official records, Thomas had left in February to return home for a family emergency. But this ledger told a different story, one written in blood-red ink that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. In the margins beside some entries were additional notes that made Clara's blood freeze. The chosen cycle approaches completion. 13 more required for the great silence. The hunger beneath grows restless. She turned to the most recent pages and found entries that couldn't possibly exist. Students who were supposedly still attending classes, still sitting in the dining hall, still walking the corridors. But here their names appeared with future dates, as if their fates had already been decided. Margaret Ashworth, October 30th, 1848. Offered. Delias Worthington, November 15th, 1848. Offered. Clara Henley, December 1st, 1848. Offered. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very elements were holding their breath. Clara stared at her own name, written in that same meticulous hand, and felt reality shift around her like sand. She had been here less than a week, had told no one her true purpose, had been careful to maintain her disguise as a theological student. Yet somehow, the headmaster had known from the moment she arrived that she was destined for whatever fate had claimed her brother. A floorboard creaked behind her. Clara spun around to find the headmaster standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the flickering lightning. In the intermittent flashes of light, his face seemed to change, aging and growing young again with each illumination. Sometimes he appeared to be the middle-aged educator she had met upon her arrival. Sometimes he looked ancient beyond measure, his skin translucent, and his eyes reflecting light, like a nocturnal predator's. "Miss Henley," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I see you've discovered our little record book." Clara clutched the ledger to her chest, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What is this place? What happened to my brother?" The headmaster stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid settling into place. "Millrow Seminary serves a purpose far older than education, my dear. We are caretakers of a tradition that stretches back to the abbey that stood here before, and to the monastery that stood before that, and to the sacred grove that existed here when the Romans first set foot on English soil." "You're insane," Clara whispered. "Am I?" The headmaster moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-lashed moors. "Every generation, certain individuals are called to serve a greater purpose. They come to us seemingly of their own free will, but in truth, they are drawn by forces beyond their understanding. Your brother felt that call, as did you." Clara backed toward the door, but found it locked from the inside. "Where would you go, Miss Henley?" "Back to your village, where no one remembers Thomas ever had a sister. Back to your family home, which now belongs to strangers who have no idea who you are." The headmaster's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "The moment you set foot on seminary grounds, you cease to exist in the world beyond these walls. Your bed in your boarding house has been rented to another girl. Your employment at the village school has been given to someone else. You are, for all practical purposes, already gone." The ledger slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers, its pages fluttering open to reveal more names, more dates, more red ink that seemed to glow in the lightning's glare. She understood now why the footsteps had followed her that first night, why the bell tolled only for her, why Margaret had vanished so completely that even her memory had been erased. This place didn't just steal bodies, it stole existence itself. The offering is not immediate. The headmaster continued, settling into the chair behind his desk as if they were discussing the weather. December 1st gives you time to acclimate, to understand your purpose. Some of our charges fight until the very end, which is unfortunate but not uncommon. Others, like your brother, eventually embrace their destiny with something approaching gratitude. Thomas would never, wouldn't he? The headmaster opened a drawer and withdrew a letter written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. He wrote this the night before his offering. Would you like me to read it aloud? Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but the headmaster's voice seemed to come from inside her skull. My dearest Clara, by the time you read this I will have joined something far greater than myself. The silence beneath Millrow Seminary is not empty, as I once believed. It is full of purpose, full of ancient wisdom, full of those who have chosen to serve rather than resist. I go willingly into that darkness, and I pray that someday you will understand. The letter was dated March 20th, 1848, one day before the red ink entry in the ledger. As Clara sank to her knees on the study floor, overwhelmed by horror and despair, one question burned through her mind like acid. If Thomas had truly embraced his fate willingly, why had he carved those desperate tally marks into his desk? And why had he slipped that warning note under her door, begging her to stop looking? Which version of her brother was real? The one who wrote a letter of acceptance, or the one who scratched his terror into wood with bleeding fingernails? Clara fled the seminary in the small hours before dawn, when the storm's fury had passed itself and the moors lay shrouded in mist that seemed to move with deliberate purpose. She had managed to escape through a window in the library, using a rope fashioned from torn bedsheets and a desperation that made her ignore the 30-foot drop to the rocky ground below. The landscape surrounding the seminary was desolate in a way that spoke of deeper corruption than simple neglect. Nothing grew here except for twisted thorn bushes and pale grass that looked diseased in the early morning light. Even the wind seemed wrong, carrying sense of decay and something else, something that reminded Clara of the copper smell of fresh blood. She had no destination in mind except away, but as she stumbled across the uneven terrain, she began to notice structures emerging from the mist. Ruins of stone cottages, their roofs long since collapsed, their walls blackened as if by fire. This had once been a village, she realized, a community of perhaps 50 families that had simply vanished from the world. The largest ruin had been a farmhouse, its foundations still solid, despite decades of abandonment. Clara took shelter inside, grateful to be out of the wind that seemed to whisper her name with increasing insistence. Among the debris of a collapsed ceiling, she found something that made her heart race, a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed but still readable. The diary belonged to a woman named Sarah Whitmore, and its entries painted a picture of growing horror that had culminated in the village's destruction. June 12, 1828. The seminary's construction continues, though the workers speak of strange discoveries beneath the foundation. Old stones covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Bones arranged in patterns that seem to shift when observed from different angles. July 3, 1828. The lights have begun appearing in the seminary windows, though no one has moved into the building yet. They dance and flicker like candles, but their color is wrong, blue-white, like the corpse light that appears above fresh graves. August 15, 1828. Children from the village have begun sleepwalking toward the seminary. We find them in the morning, standing at its gates with their eyes open but unseeing. When we bring them home, they speak of voices calling from beneath the earth. September 30th, 1828. The ground around the seminary has become soft, as if something underneath is disturbing the soil. Strange growths have appeared, mushrooms that glow faintly in the dark and give off an odor of rot and sweetness combined. The final entries were written in an increasingly unsteady hand. October 13th, 1828. They came for the children first, not by force, but by invitation. The young ones simply walked out of their homes in the middle of the night, following a procession of figures in dark robes who seemed to glide rather than walk. We tried to follow, but the mist rose from nowhere and blinded us completely. October 20th, 1828. Half the village is gone. The seminary stands complete now, its bells ringing at all hours, though we see no one in its towers. The headmaster arrived yesterday, a tall man who claims to be 40 years old, but whose eyes are older than the stones he walks upon. October 31st, 1828. I am the last. The others went willingly in the end, drawn by promises of purpose and belonging. But I remember the old stories, the warnings passed down from grandmother to granddaughter about this cursed ground. The monks who were burned here centuries ago did not die quietly. They bound their souls to the earth itself, waiting for someone foolish enough to build upon their graves. The diary's final entry was a single line, written in what looked like blood. Clara clutched the diary to her chest as she read, understanding finally why the seminary had been built here, on this particular patch of moorland where nothing grew and nothing thrived. It wasn't a chance that had drawn the institution to this location, it was a necessity. The corrupted ground demanded regular feeding, and the seminary provided a steady supply of young souls to satisfy that ancient hunger. When she returned to the seminary just after dawn, Clara found that her absence had not gone unnoticed. Students whispered in the corridors, their voices carrying a new note of fear. But it wasn't fear of punishment for her unauthorized departure that chilled Clara's blood. It was the realization that once again someone had been erased from existence. Elias Worthington was gone. Not just missing from breakfast or absent from morning prayers, but gone in the complete and terrifying way that Margaret had been gone. His belongings had vanished from his dormitory room, his name had been scratched out of every register, and when Clara asked about him, her fellow students looked at her with genuine confusion. "Elias who?" they asked, and their puzzlement was clearly sincere. But Clara remembered him. She remembered his whispered warnings about students who disappeared in twos and threes, his terror when he spoke of the seminary's powerful benefactors, his nervous habit of glancing at shadows as if expecting them to move independently. She remembered, and that memory felt like a weight that might crush her soul. The headmaster found her in the library that afternoon, surrounded by books she couldn't focus on reading. His presence filled the space like smoke, making it difficult to breathe. "You're troubled, Miss Henley," he observed, settling into the chair across from her reading table. "Perhaps you're beginning to understand the futility of resistance." "Where is Elias?" Clara demanded. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," the headmaster replied with perfect sincerity. "Are you quite well? You look pale." Clara stared into his ageless eyes and saw something there that made her stomach turn. Not malice exactly, but a kind of vast indifference that was infinitely worse. To him, she and Thomas and Elias and Margaret were not people with hopes and dreams and families who loved them. They were simply entries in a ledger, resources to be managed and eventually consumed. "The offering approaches," he said softly, and Clara realized he was no longer speaking to her but to something else entirely. Something that listened from beneath the seminary's foundations and grew stronger with each soul it devoured. That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind howl across the moors, she made a decision that would determine whether she lived or died, whether she was remembered or erased, whether she found Thomas or joined him in whatever darkness had claimed his soul. She was going to find that bell. She was going to descend into the seminary's deepest places. And she was going to discover what happened to everyone who had been marked for offering in that blood-red ledger. The question that should terrify you is this: When you're the only person left who remembers the disappeared, does that make you their last hope for salvation, or simply the next name to be crossed out in red ink? The sound came first as a vibration in the floorboards, a tremor that Clara felt in her bones before her ears registered the deep, resonant toll. Midnight. The seminary's invisible bell was ringing again, and this time Clara was ready. She had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, stealing candles and rope, mapping the seminary's lower levels, and trying to ignore the way reality seemed to be unraveling around her. More students had begun to look through her as if she weren't there, and twice she had caught herself checking mirrors to make sure she still cast a reflection. The bell tolled 12 times, each note seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But Clara had finally identified its source, somewhere deep beneath the seminary's foundation, in spaces that shouldn't exist according to the building's architectural plans. She made her way through corridors that grew narrower and more primitive the deeper she descended. The seminary's upper levels maintained their facade of educational purpose, but down here the mask slipped away entirely. The walls were carved with the same symbols she had seen beneath the chapel altar, spirals and knots that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of earth and decay, and something else, something organic and alive. She found the entrance to the deeper levels behind a wooden door that had been painted to look like part of the wall. The passage beyond was more tunnel than corridor, carved directly from the living rock and descending at a steep angle that made Clara wonder just how far beneath the moors these spaces extended. The bell's location became clear when she reached a circular chamber deep in the seminary's foundations. Ancient iron, green with verdigris and covered in the same twisting symbols that adorned the walls, hung suspended from chains that disappeared into the darkness above. But there were no ropes, no mechanism visible that could have set it ringing. The bell simply existed here, patient and eternal, waiting for its next summons. Clara approached it carefully, her candle flame dancing in drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. The metal was cold to the touch, so cold that her fingers stuck to its surface for a moment before she could pull them away. And when she touched it, images flooded her mind with the force of a physical blow. She saw Thomas, her brother, standing in this very chamber, with his eyes wide and unseeing. She saw Margaret Ashworth reaching toward the bell with trembling hands. She saw Elias Worthington backing away from something Clara couldn't see, his mouth open in a scream that made no sound. And she saw others, dozens of others, all the names from the headmaster's ledger. They stood in a circle around the bell, their faces pale and their lips moving in unison, speaking words in a language that predated human speech. Their eyes were empty of everything except hunger, an endless gnawing hunger that could never be satisfied. Clara jerked her hand back from the bell, but the visions continued. She saw the seminary as it truly was, not a school but a feeding ground, not a place of learning but a carefully constructed trap designed to lure young souls into darkness. Every student who had ever walked through those gates had been selected, chosen for qualities that made them suitable offerings to whatever ancient things slumbered beneath the moors. The bell began to toll again, though Clara had not touched it. 1, 2, 3. Each note seemed to pull at something deep inside her chest, as if the sound itself was trying to tear her soul from her body. 4, 5, 6. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the tolling came from inside her skull now, reverberating through her bones. 7, 8, 9. Clara turned to flee, but the chamber had changed around her. The walls were closer now, closing in with each toll of the bell. The passage she had used to enter was gone, replaced by solid stone that looked as if it had never been disturbed. 10, 11. Clara. She spun toward the voice and saw Thomas standing in the shadows at the edge of her candlelight. But this wasn't the brother she remembered from childhood, full of life and laughter and dreams of changing the world. This Thomas was pale and still, his skin translucent, and his eyes reflecting light like pools of black water. "Thomas," Clara whispered. 12. The bell's final toll seemed to hang in the air forever, and in that suspended moment Clara saw the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of deception and erasure. The students who disappeared weren't taken against their will. They were transformed, made into something else, something that could exist in the spaces between life and death. They became part of the seminary's hunger, servants of whatever vast presence had claimed this cursed ground centuries ago. "You shouldn't have come here," Thomas said, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "But now that you have, you can join us. It's not as terrible as you imagine, Clara. The silence is full of purpose. The darkness is full of belonging." Clara shook her head, backing away from this thing that wore her brother's face. "You're not Thomas. Thomas would never—" "I am what Thomas became," the creature replied. "What he chose to become when he understood the truth about this place, what you will become too when the time comes." "Never." Thomas smiled, and Clara saw that his teeth had grown sharp, adapted for purposes she didn't want to imagine. "The offering is in 3 days, Clara, December 1st, as recorded in the ledger. You can resist until then, if you wish. You can run through the seminary's halls and pound on doors that won't open. You can scream until your throat bleeds, though no one will hear you. Or you can accept your destiny with grace, as I eventually did." The chamber began to spin around Clara, or perhaps she was spinning while the chamber remained still. Either way, the candle fell from her numb fingers and went out, plunging her into absolute darkness. In that darkness, she heard whispers from dozens of voices, all speaking her name in unison, all calling her to join them in the silence beneath the seminary. When she regained consciousness, Clara found herself back in her dormitory room with no memory of how she had gotten there. Dawn light was streaming through her window, and for a moment she wondered if the entire experience had been a nightmare brought on by stress and fear. But her shoes were caked with mud from the seminary's foundations, and in her palm, burned into her flesh like a brand, was the outline of the bell she had touched in that impossible chamber. The mark pulsed with her heartbeat, and Clara realized with growing horror that it was counting down to something. 3 days until December 1st. 3 days until the offering. 3 days to find a way to save not just herself, but every soul that had been trapped in the seminary's web of darkness. But how do you fight an enemy that can erase you from existence? How do you rescue people who have been transformed into something inhuman? And how do you escape a place that exists partially outside of reality itself? These questions burned in Clara's mind as she stared at the brand on her palm, and she knew that the answers would determine whether she found salvation or joined the chorus of voices that whispered her name from beneath the seminary's foundations. Clara's descent into the seminary's true heart began at 3 in the morning, when the building settled into its deepest quiet, and the barriers between worlds grew thin. She had spent 2 days studying the layout of the lower levels, mapping every passage and chamber she could find, but nothing had prepared her for what lay beyond the bell chamber. The passage, she discovered, was older than the seminary, older perhaps than human civilization in this part of England. Carved directly from bedrock and lined with stones that bore symbols predating any known writing system, it descended at a steep angle that made Clara's ears pop with the change in pressure. Her candles flickered in drafts that shouldn't exist so far underground, and more than once she had to stop and steady herself against walls that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The first chamber she entered made her question her sanity. It was vast, far larger than the seminary's footprint above, with a ceiling that disappeared into absolute darkness. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing what looked like a medieval sarcophagus. But when Clara approached the nearest one, she discovered something that made her blood freeze. The stone lid was transparent, like crystal or ice, and through it she could see a perfectly preserved human form. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, lying with his hands folded across his chest and his eyes closed in what might have been a peaceful sleep. His skin was pale but unmarked by decay, and Clara could swear she saw his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. She moved to the next alcove and found another sleeper, this one a woman with long red hair that Clara recognized instantly. Margaret Ashworth lay in her crystal tomb, as beautiful and still as a fairy tale princess. But when Clara placed her hand against the transparent lid, Margaret's eyes snapped open. Those eyes were no longer human. They reflected light, like a nocturnal predator's. And when Margaret's lips moved, Clara could hear her voice despite the barrier between them. "Join us, Clara. Join us in the silence where all questions are answered." Clara stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs, and began moving frantically from alcove to alcove. Each one contained another missing student, another name from the headmaster's ledger, another soul that had been claimed by whatever power ruled this underground realm. They were all perfectly preserved, all seemingly asleep, but their eyes followed Clara's movement with inhuman awareness. In the chamber's center stood a raised dais, surrounded by 12 stone pillars, each one carved with intricate reliefs that told a story Clara wished she couldn't understand. The images showed a progression from ancient times to the present day, druids performing rituals around a sacred grove, Roman soldiers fleeing in terror from something that pursued them through the darkness, monks building an abbey on cursed ground, and finally the construction of Millrow Seminary itself. But it was the final set of images that made Clara's legs give out beneath her. They showed her, unmistakably her, standing in this very chamber with her hand pressed against one of the crystal tombs. In the carving, her eyes held the same inhuman light as Margaret's, and her mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a song of welcome. The images were old, carved centuries before Clara's birth, yet they depicted her with perfect accuracy down to the scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. Somehow, the thing that ruled this place had known she would come here, had been expecting her arrival since before she was born. "The carvings are beautiful, aren't they?" Clara spun around to find the headmaster standing at the chamber's entrance, his ageless face serene in the candlelight. But here, in this place of ancient power, his human disguise had begun to slip. His skin was translucent, showing dark veins beneath, and his eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. "How long have you been planning this?" Clara asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Planning suggests a beginning," the headmaster replied, moving closer with movements that were too fluid to be entirely human. "This has always been, Miss Henley. The cycle is eternal, as old as the stones beneath our feet. I am simply its current custodian, as my predecessors were before me." Clara backed toward the wall of alcoves, trying to keep distance between herself and the thing that wore the headmaster's form. The portraits in the study, they were all you, weren't they? The same face, the same person, for over 200 years. "Person is such a limiting term," the headmaster said with a smile that revealed teeth grown sharp with centuries of feeding. "I became something more than human long ago when I first accepted the gift that this place offers. Immortality, Clara. Purpose beyond the brief flame of mortal existence. Your brother understood this. In the end, he embraced transformation willingly. Where is he?" The headmaster gestured toward the alcoves lining the chamber walls. "He sleeps the sleep of the chosen, along with all the others who have been honored with selection. They dream, Miss Henley. Such dreams would drive ordinary minds to madness. They dream of the time before time, when the barriers between worlds were thin, and beings of vast power walked freely beneath the stars." Clara's back pressed against the cold stone, and she realized she had nowhere left to retreat. The sleeping figures in their crystal tombs seemed to be watching her with growing intensity, their inhuman eyes reflecting her candle's flame like captured stars. "But sleep is not their final state," the headmaster continued. "On certain nights when the stars align properly and the barriers weaken, they wake. They rise from their tombs and walk among the living, serving purposes that mortal minds cannot comprehend. Your brother has been quite useful in this regard. He helped us arrange your arrival at the seminary, wrote letters in his own hand to ensure you would come seeking him. Clara remembered the note that had been slipped under her door. Stop looking or join us in silence. Written in Thomas's handwriting, but composed by something that was no longer entirely her brother. Tomorrow night is such a night, the headmaster said. December 1st, when the barrier between sleeping and waking, between life and whatever lies beyond, becomes permeable. The chosen will rise, and you will join them willingly or by force. The outcome is the same. And if I refuse? The headmaster's laugh was like wind through broken glass. Refuse, my dear Miss Henley. You ceased to have choices the moment you set foot on seminary grounds. Your fate was carved in stone centuries before your birth. You are here not by accident or even by design, but by necessity. The cycle demands completion, and you are its final component. Clara felt something cold and smooth against her back and realized she had pressed against one of the crystal tombs. Inside she could see another perfectly preserved figure, but this alcove was different from the others. It was empty except for silk cushions arranged to cradle a human form, and Clara understood with sick certainty that this tomb had been prepared specifically for her. The headmaster saw her realization and nodded approvingly. Your place has been waiting, Miss Henley. Soon you will join the eternal silence, and your questions will trouble you no more. But Clara wasn't ready to surrender, not when she finally understood the true scope of the horror that had claimed her brother and so many others. The seminary wasn't just feeding on individual souls, it was building something, accumulating power for a purpose that stretched far beyond the moors of northern England. As the headmaster moved closer, his form shifting and blurring in the candlelight, Clara made a desperate decision. She threw herself against the nearest crystal tomb, the one containing Margaret Ashworth, and began striking the transparent surface with her fists. "Wake up," she screamed. "All of you, wake up. Remember who you were before this place claimed you." The tomb's surface cracked under her assault, and Margaret's eyes snapped fully open, blazing with inhuman light. But for just a moment, Clara saw something else there, a flicker of the frightened girl who had warned her about the chapel, the human soul still trapped beneath layers of supernatural transformation. That flicker was enough to shake the entire chamber. The other tombs began to crack as well, and the headmaster's confident expression shifted to something approaching an alarm. "What have you done?" he hissed. Clara smiled through her tears and blood from her split knuckles. "I reminded them," she said. "I reminded them that they were human once, and that somewhere deep inside they still are." The sleeping figures in their crystal prisons began to stir, and Clara realized she had awakened something that the seminary's masters had never intended to awaken. The question now was whether what emerged would be salvation or something far worse than the darkness she was trying to escape. The cracks in Margaret's tomb spread like spider webs across the crystal surface, each fracture glowing with pale light that seemed to come from within. Margaret's eyes no longer reflecting inhuman hunger, but blazing with something that might have been recognition, locked onto Clara's face. "I remember," Margaret whispered, her voice muffled by the crystal but clearly audible. "I remember who I was before the silence claimed me." The headmaster lunged toward Clara, his human facade finally dropping entirely. His skin had become translucent, revealing a network of dark veins that pulsed with unnatural life. His fingers had elongated into claws, and when he opened his mouth, Clara saw row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, designed for purposes that made her soul recoil. "You don't understand what you've done," he snarled, his voice now carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "The chosen must sleep until the Great Awakening. Their consciousness must be suppressed, their humanity dissolved. If they remember themselves, if they resist the transformation." Margaret's tomb shattered with a sound like breaking bells. The girl who emerged was pale and moved with unnatural grace, but her eyes held something the headmaster clearly hadn't expected to see: defiance. "I remember the terror," Margaret said, rising from the crystal fragments. I remember the night you came for me, how you made me walk to this chamber against my will. But most of all, I remember Clara trying to warn me in the chapel, and how I chose to help her instead of protecting myself. Other tombs began to crack and shatter as their occupants stirred to wakefulness. Elias Worthington emerged from his crystal prison with his scholarly demeanor intact, but his eyes now glowing with the same pale light as Margaret's. A dozen other students Clara didn't recognize rose from their resting places, each one remembering fragments of their humanity that the seminary's power had tried to erase. But it was the figure who emerged from the tomb at the chamber's far end that made Clara's heart stop. Thomas stepped out of his crystal prison, his face gaunt but recognizably her brother's, his eyes holding a mixture of inhuman transformation and very human pain. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of vast spaces and endless time, "you shouldn't have come here. You should have listened to my warning and stayed away." "Thomas, it's me," Clara said, stepping toward him despite the obvious changes in his appearance. "I came to find you to bring you home." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Home, Clara? I haven't been human for 8 months. The thing that wrote letters to our parents, the creature that slipped warnings under your door, that was me, but not me. The seminary doesn't just steal bodies, sister. It steals souls and remakes them into something else entirely." The headmaster backed away from the awakening students, his confidence replaced by something that might have been fear. "This is not how the cycle completes itself," he said, addressing not Clara, but something else entirely, something that listened from the deeper darkness beyond the chamber. "The chosen are supposed to embrace their transformation willingly. They're supposed to feed the great silence until it grows strong enough to..." "To what?" Clara demanded. "What is this place really building toward?" It was Thomas who answered, his transformed senses apparently allowing him to perceive things hidden from purely human awareness. "The seminary isn't just feeding on individual souls, Clara. It's accumulating power for something much larger. Every student who disappears, every consciousness that gets absorbed into the silence, they become part of a vast collective that's been growing stronger for centuries." Margaret nodded, her own enhanced perception revealing additional layers of the truth. "The thing that rules this place isn't originally from our world. It came from somewhere else, somewhere between the spaces we think of as reality. But it needs anchors in our world, consciousness and life force to keep it stable here." "And when will it's collected enough?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "When it's strong enough, it won't need to hide beneath a seminary anymore," Elias said, his scholarly mind quickly grasping the implications. "It will be able to manifest fully in our world, to remake reality according to its own nature. The seminary was never the end goal, it was just the chrysalis." The chamber shuddered around them, and Clara realized that their conversation was being overheard by something vast and ancient and increasingly angry. The stone walls began to weep moisture that glowed with the same pale light as the students' eyes, and from somewhere far below came a sound like wind through enormous spaces. "You've doomed yourselves," the headmaster said, his form beginning to dissolve at the edges as if he were made of smoke. "And you've doomed your world as well. The Great Awakening cannot be stopped now. You've simply ensured that it will be violent rather than peaceful." Thomas moved to Clara's side, and she was startled to feel warmth radiating from his transformed body. "There might be a way," he said quietly. "The consciousness we've retained, the humanity we remember, it's poison to the collective. We're no longer pure food for the silence. We've become contaminated in its system." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "If enough of the chosen remember themselves, if we can maintain our individual consciousness instead of dissolving into the collective, we might be able to corrupt the entire structure from within," Margaret explained. "Instead of feeding the silence, we could starve it. Instead of strengthening the entity that rules this place, we could weaken it to the point where it loses its hold on our reality." The chamber was beginning to collapse around them, stones falling from the ceiling as whatever vast presence lurked in the deeper darkness began to stir with increasing violence. The awakened students gathered around Clara, their transformed bodies glowing with pale light, but their eyes holding the spark of remembered humanity. "But there's a cost," Thomas said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "To maintain our consciousness, to resist full absorption into the collective, we have to remain here. We can't return to the world above, can't reclaim our old lives. We become eternal guardians, keeping the silence contained through the strength of our individual will." Clara looked around at the faces of the students who had been lost to the seminary's hunger. Margaret, barely 18, with her entire life stolen from her. Elias, whose scholarly dreams had been cut short by ancient evil. Thomas, her beloved brother, transformed into something inhuman but still recognizably himself in the ways that mattered most. "There has to be another way," she said. "There is," Thomas replied. "But it requires a sacrifice that none of us have the right to ask of you." Before Clara could ask what he meant, the headmaster's dissolving form spoke one final time. "December 1st has arrived, Miss Henley. The Great Awakening begins now, regardless of your choices. You can join us willingly, resist and be consumed, or watch as everything you've ever known is remade in the image of the silence." The chamber filled with a sound like breaking glass, and Clara realized that the barriers between worlds were shattering. Reality itself was beginning to crack, and through those cracks something vast and hungry was preparing to emerge. The question that had haunted her since arriving at the seminary now took on cosmic importance. How do you fight an enemy that exists partially outside reality itself? And what are you willing to sacrifice to protect a world that doesn't even know it's in danger? Clara's refusal to submit to the seminary's will sent shockwaves through the ancient foundations that rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. The chamber walls began to weep. Not moisture, but something darker and more viscous that moved with deliberate purpose across the carved symbols. Where the liquid touched stone, the symbols began to glow with malevolent light, activating systems that had been dormant for centuries. "You don't understand what you've awakened," Thomas said, his transformed senses allowing him to perceive changes that Clara's human awareness couldn't detect. "The entity that rules this place, it's been sleeping, conserving its strength, while we feed it our consciousness one drop at a time. But now that its food supply has been contaminated, now that we're resisting instead of surrendering," the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythm that was almost like breathing, deep, slow, and vast beyond comprehension. Clara realized with sick certainty that they were standing on top of something enormous, something that had been using the seminary as little more than a feeding tube while it slumbered in spaces between reality. "It's waking up," Margaret whispered, her enhanced perception revealing layers of truth that made her transformed features go pale with terror. "All these years, all these decades of carefully managed feeding, we were keeping it sedated. But now," the chamber suddenly expanded around them, walls rushing outward until they disappeared entirely into darkness. Clara found herself standing with the awakened students on a small island of stone surrounded by an abyss that seemed to have no bottom, and from that abyss came sounds that predated human language, grinding, scraping, the movement of something massive and ancient stirring to wakefulness after eons of sleep. "Behold your achievement, Miss Henley." The headmaster's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, his dissolving form now little more than a shadow with burning eyes. "You sought to save your brother, but instead you've doomed your world. The silence that devours has awakened, and it hungers for more than the few souls we could provide through careful cultivation." Clara watched in horror as the darkness around their island began to take shape. What she had mistaken for empty space was actually the form of something so vast that her mind had initially refused to process it. Tentacles thick as tree trunks, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Eyes like burning stars too numerous to count, opening throughout a body that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. But most terrifying of all were the faces, Thousands upon thousands of human faces embedded in the creature's flesh, each one still conscious, still aware, still silently screaming. Clara recognized some of them from the seminary's records: students who had disappeared decades ago, teachers who had asked too many questions, visitors who had stumbled onto the truth. All of them had been absorbed into the entity's substance, their consciousness preserved to feed its hunger for human experience and emotion. The early offerings were crude, the headmaster explained, his voice now coming from the creature itself. We simply fed it bodies and souls, which satisfied its basic needs but provided no real nourishment. But as we learned to refine our techniques, we discovered that consciousness was the true delicacy: human awareness, human emotion, human hope and fear and love. These were the flavors that made our offerings truly valuable. Clara saw Thomas among the faces embedded in the creature's flesh. But this wasn't the transformed brother who stood beside her. This was the original Thomas, the one who had been absorbed months ago, his consciousness trapped within the entity's substance, while his body had been used as a lure to draw Clara to the seminary. "You're seeing the truth now," Thomas beside her said sadly. "I'm not really your brother, Clara. I'm a construct made from his memories and personality, created by the entity to serve its purposes. The real Thomas is part of that thing now, along with everyone else who was ever offered to the silence." Clara's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to her knees on the stone island that seemed increasingly fragile in the face of the vast horror surrounding them. Everything she had believed, every hope she had clung to, had been built on lies. Her brother was gone, had been gone for months, and the creature she had been trying to save was nothing more than an echo created by the thing that had devoured his soul. "But echoes can become real," Margaret said suddenly, her voice cutting through Clara's despair. "If we hold on to our humanity strongly enough, if we refuse to let the silence dissolve our individual consciousness, we can become more than just constructs. We can become ourselves again, even if we started as something else." The entity that filled the abyss around them began to contract, drawing its massive form into a more concentrated shape. Clara realized it was preparing to leave the underground spaces that had contained it for so long, preparing to emerge into the world above where it could feed on humanity without the limitations imposed by secrecy and careful management. The seminary was never the goal, the false Thomas said, his form becoming more solid and real as he spoke. It was just a cocoon, a safe space where the entity could grow strong enough to survive in your reality. Now that it's ready to emerge, it no longer needs to hide. "But we can stop it," Elias said, his scholarly mind working through possibilities even in the face of cosmic horror. "If enough of us maintain our individual consciousness, if we refuse to be absorbed completely, we can create a kind of spiritual infection in its system. Instead of feeding on pure human consciousness, it would be consuming contaminated material, awareness that fights back instead of surrendering." "And what would that accomplish?" Clara asked. "It would weaken the entity's hold on our reality," Margaret explained. "Make it harder for it to maintain a coherent form in our world. If we could contaminate enough of its absorbed consciousness, we might be able to force it back into the spaces between worlds where it came from." The entity's attention focused on their small group with the weight of a collapsing star. When it spoke, its voice came from every absorbed consciousness at once, creating a sound like an infinite choir of the damned. "Your resistance is futile, little constructs. You are made from the consciousness I have already consumed. Your defiance only provides more interesting flavors for my appreciation." But Clara was beginning to understand something that the entity, for all its vast intelligence, had missed. The constructs it had created to lure new victims to the seminary had been made from the memories and personalities of the absorbed consciousness, but they had also been given independent existence. They were copies, not extensions, and copies could choose their own path. "We're not fighting for ourselves," Clara said, rising to her feet despite the cosmic horror surrounding them. "We're fighting for everyone who's been absorbed, everyone whose consciousness is trapped in that thing's substance. If we can prove that individual awareness can resist absorption, maybe we can show them how to fight back from within. The Thomas construct nodded, his form becoming more solid and real with each passing moment. The real Thomas is in there somewhere, along with Margaret and Elias and everyone else. If we can reach them, if we can remind them of who they were, they might be able to break free from within. Margaret finished. Not their bodies. Those are gone forever. But their consciousness, their souls, those might be able to achieve some kind of liberation. The entity's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. You understand nothing of the forces you're attempting to oppose. I am older than your civilization, vaster than your planet, more patient than time itself. Your small rebellions are merely seasoning for the feast I am about to enjoy. Clara looked around at the constructs who had chosen to stand with her, echoes of the dead who had decided to become real through the strength of their defiance. They were all that stood between this cosmic horror and a world that didn't even know it was in danger. Maybe we can't win, she said. Maybe we're just delaying the inevitable. But if we're going to lose, we're going to make sure that thing knows it was in a fight. The question that should keep you awake tonight is this. If you discovered that everything you believed about yourself was a lie, that you were nothing more than an echo of someone who had already died, would you still choose to fight for what was right? Would you still try to save a world that might not even remember your sacrifice? Because sometimes being human isn't about the flesh and blood you're made of. Sometimes it's about the choices you make when everything seems hopeless. The seminary above them began to collapse as the entity stirred to full wakefulness, its massive form no longer content to remain hidden in the spaces between reality. Clara felt the vibrations through the stone island where she and the awakened constructs made their desperate stand, each tremor marking another section of the building's destruction. But something unexpected was happening in the abyss around them. The faces embedded in the entity's flesh, thousands of absorbed consciousnesses that had been silent for decades, were beginning to show signs of awareness. Where Clara's group had achieved individuality through defiance, the absorbed souls were remembering themselves through witnessing that defiance. Look, Thomas said, pointing to a section of the creature's form where the embedded faces were moving their lips in unison. They weren't screaming anymore. They were speaking, their voices barely audible, but growing stronger with each word. We remember who we were. The entity's attention turned inward. Its vast intelligence suddenly focused on the rebellion stirring within its own substance. Impossible, it said, its voice no longer carrying the absolute confidence of earlier moments. Absorbed consciousness cannot maintain individual identity. The process is irreversible. Maybe it was irreversible, Margaret said, her construct form blazing with light that seemed to come from pure will. But you made a mistake when you created us. You gave us independence to serve your purposes, but independence is a dangerous gift. It spreads. Clara understood what Margaret meant. Their defiance wasn't just an external threat to the entity, it was serving as an example to the absorbed souls, showing them that individual consciousness could resist the collective silence. Every moment they maintained their separate identities, every act of rebellion they performed, created ripples that spread throughout the entity's vast form. The absorbed faces were speaking more clearly now, their individual voices beginning to separate from the collective choir. I was Sarah Whitmore. I was Marcus Chen. I was Elizabeth Thornfield. I remember my name, I remember my life, I remember choosing to resist. The entity began to convulse, its massive form twisting as it tried to suppress the uprising within its own substance. But the rebellion was spreading faster than it could contain, consciousness after consciousness remembering themselves and choosing individual identity over collective absorption. The contamination is spreading, Elias observed, his scholarly mind still working even in the face of cosmic upheaval. Each soul that remembers itself makes it easier for others to do the same. It's becoming a cascade effect. Clara felt a strange sensation, as if something was trying to pull her consciousness out of her constructed body. For a terrifying moment, she thought the entity was attempting to absorb her directly, but then she realized the truth was both more complex and more hopeful. "It's trying to take us back," she said, "to reabsorb our consciousness into its collective. But we're not just constructs anymore. We've become real through our choices, our defiance, our refusal to surrender our individuality." The Thomas construct nodded, his form now as solid and real as any living person. "And if we're real, if we've achieved true independent existence, then we can make a choice the absorbed souls can't make." "What choice?" Clara asked. "We can choose to go back in," Margaret said, understanding dawning in her eyes, "not as victims being absorbed, but as active agents. We can carry our independence directly into the entity's consciousness, spreading the contamination from within." The entity's voice rose to a shriek that shattered stone and cracked reality itself. "No, the cycle must complete. The Great Awakening cannot be stopped." But Clara was no longer listening to the creature's protests. She was listening to the voices of the absorbed souls, growing stronger and more individual with each passing moment. She could hear the real Thomas among them now, not the construct beside her, but her actual brother, calling out from within the entity's substance. "Clara, can you hear me? I remember now. I remember who I was before this thing took me." The choice before her was clear and terrible. She could remain on the stone island with the other constructs, maintaining their separate existence while the entity eventually broke free and devoured the world above. Or she could surrender her hard-won independence and dive back into the collective consciousness, carrying the virus of individuality directly into the entity's core. "If we do this," Thomas said, the construct speaking in perfect synchronization with the absorbed soul's voice, "we might not survive as separate beings. We might be lost in the collective even as we try to save it." Clara looked around at her companions, constructs who had chosen to become real, echoes who had decided to matter, shadows who had embraced the light of individual consciousness. Margaret, brave and defiant, even in the face of cosmic horror. Elias, still seeking knowledge and truth, even when those discoveries might destroy him. Thomas, both the construct and the absorbed soul, unified in their determination to protect the world they had been forced to leave behind. "Some things are worth dying for," Clara said, "and some things are worth being forgotten for." The entity seemed to sense their intention, its massive form contracting as it tried to shield itself from the contamination they represented. But it was too late. The absorbed souls were already breaking free from collective identity, each one remembering their names and their humanity and their right to exist as individuals. Clara took a deep breath that her constructed lungs didn't really need and dove into the abyss. The sensation of reabsorption was like drowning in reverse. Instead of losing breath, she was losing individual identity, feeling her consciousness spread out and dilute among thousands of other souls. But instead of surrendering to the process, Clara held tight to her memories, her personality, her determination to remain herself even as she became part of something larger. Around her, she felt the presence of the other constructs, making the same choice. Margaret's fierce protectiveness, Elias's insatiable curiosity, Thomas's loving concern for his sister, all of them maintaining their individual sparks, even as they joined the collective consciousness. And their example spread like wildfire through the entity's substance. Soul after soul remembered themselves, chose independence over collective identity, embraced the messy, painful, beautiful complexity of individual consciousness over the cold perfection of the silence. The entity's form began to collapse in on itself, its hold on reality weakening, as more and more of its absorbed consciousness chose defiance over submission. The seminary above them crumbled completely, its stones scattering across the moors as the cosmic horror that had sustained it for centuries lost its grip on the physical world. Clara felt herself beginning to dissolve, her individual identity spreading too thin to maintain coherence. But just before she lost herself completely, she felt something that made her final moments worthwhile. The touch of other souls, thousands of them, each one maintaining their separate identity, even as they formed a new kind of collective. Not a silence that devoured, but a chorus that celebrated the infinite variety of human consciousness. The entity's death scream shattered reality itself, sending cracks through the barriers between worlds. But instead of allowing something worse to emerge, those cracks became pathways for the liberated souls to return to the realm of light and life and individual existence. Clara's last coherent thought was of Thomas, not the construct, but her real brother, free at last from the silence that had claimed him. She felt his consciousness brush against hers one final time, carrying with it a message of love and gratitude and goodbye. Then darkness claimed her, and Clara Henley ceased to exist as a separate being. The ruins of Millrow Seminary were discovered 3 days later by travelers who reported seeing strange lights dancing across the moors. Official records show that the building suffered complete structural collapse due to an underground cave-in, a geological instability that had been developing for decades. No bodies were ever found in the wreckage. The land was eventually sold to a developer who planned to build a modern housing estate, but construction was abandoned after workers reported feeling watched by unseen observers and hearing voices calling from beneath the ground. The property remains empty to this day, surrounded by fencing that bears signs warning of unstable foundations and dangerous excavations. But sometimes, on nights when the wind blows just right across the Yorkshire moors, local residents report hearing something that sounds like singing, not the cold silence that had once emanated from the seminary, but something warmer and more human. A chorus of individual voices joined together in harmony, celebrating their freedom from the darkness that had tried to claim them. They say if you listen carefully to that song, you can hear specific voices among the choir. A young woman with fierce determination, calling out to anyone who might be in danger. A scholarly young man, sharing knowledge to help others avoid the traps that claimed him. A brother and sister, reunited at last in something beyond death, but not quite life. And sometimes, very rarely, when someone finds themselves in true danger from forces beyond their understanding, that chorus becomes more than just sound. It becomes guidance, protection, a reminder that even in the darkest places, human consciousness can choose to resist, to remember, to remain defiantly, beautifully individual. The seminary's victims were never truly dead, and they were never truly free. But they had achieved something perhaps more important than either. They had become eternal guardians, watching over a world that would never know how close it had come to being consumed by silence. Clara Henley's name appears in no official records, and no one remembers that she ever existed. But her choice to sacrifice individual existence for the preservation of individual consciousness itself echoes through every act of defiance against forces that would reduce human beings to mere resources to be consumed. The question that should stay with you long after you've finished listening is this. In a world where so many forces try to make us all the same, to silence our individual voices and absorb us into mindless collectives, what are you willing to sacrifice to remain truly, uniquely yourself? Because Clara Henley's story isn't really about supernatural horror. It's about the horror of losing yourself and the courage it takes to choose individual consciousness over collective comfort, even when that choice leads to darkness. The seminary is gone, but the silence it served still whispers in the corners of our world, still tries to convince us that surrender is easier than resistance, that conformity is safer than individuality. Listen for that whisper, and when you hear it, remember Clara's choice. Remember that sometimes the most human thing you can do is refuse to stop being human, no matter what forces try to claim your soul. Remember that consciousness itself is an act of rebellion against the void. And keep singing your own song, even if you have to sing it alone.